Welcome to Moore's Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Binden, and I'm the host of this and also the chair of the Moore Board of Directors. With me today in our studio is Stephen G. Jackson, who's a longtime resident of Nebraska and has worked in many settings related to community engagement. I know years ago he worked in Lincoln with one of the local departments in the state. I invited him to talk about his work dealing with bringing African Americans, and particularly African American males, into talking more about LGBTQ plus, or for others, homosexual African American male issues, and also and helping us with some of the terminology. I also wanted him to just give us some information on. He's recently wrote a book and talk more about that book on this show, and some of the things, the poems and things he's written related to that. So first, Steve, welcome to More Throwing Down Some Heavy Light.
Thanks for having me, Jamal. Appreciate it.
Good. Now, first, share with the viewer and audience a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. I was born in South Carolina and grew up in a Baptist church and Baptist religion, very religious family. At the age of 18, I joined the military, left South Carolina with no plans of going back other than to visit. I spent almost 4 years in the service, traveled in Europe, and then came to Offutt. And that's how I ended up in Nebraska almost 40 years ago. But when I left Nebraska and went back to the Carolinas, I couldn't find a job. It was during the Depression in the mid 80s. I moved to DC, couldn't find a job there, came back to Omaha, and with my military background, I was able to get a job right away. I went to college and got my undergrad degree, and then later got my master's. So here I am.
Good, good. Now, many of us raised in the North like to think of southern states as full of apartheid and segregation and backwards regarding how they treat African Americans and other people of color. What was it like for you growing up in South Carolina and subsequently moving to Nebraska as African American? Again, we have stereotypes of the southern states, especially those of us who grew up in Nebraska. But give us a little bit more light. What was it like growing up in particularly a state like South Carolina?
There was a lot of racism and bigotry. I remember that there was a place, and I grew up in a rural area, so we were 17 miles either way from the next largest town or county seat. So in the one county seat, we'd drive by and there'd be a line of Black folk, African Americans, outside of this window ordering food. I never thought about it. This was 1975, 76. And there were still places in this county seat, in this town, where Blacks could not go into restaurants. They had to order from a window. I didn't know what the deal was at the time. My parents did a really good job of sheltering us from racism and bigotry and flat out just hatred and bigotry. I remember that we would go to this one store in the other county, and Pops would go in. They had always raised us to respect our elders. We say yes or no, sir, no, sir, no, ma'am, yes, ma'am. But we go into this one store, and this younger white man would always address my dad as boy.
Wow.
It irritated me. I'm like, what? Why don't you say something? And you would like knock me down if I said something to one of my elders and talk to him that way. And I didn't understand it. So I was upset with my father about this. Like, why aren't you standing up? Why aren't you saying something? I didn't understand the dynamic at that point between white men and the power they had over my father. So it was very prevalent. It was very prevalent. I remember going to an amusement park and these white guys cutting line in front of us, and my sister being furious but not able to say anything. And I didn't understand why she didn't confront them. But you know, why create a problem when she knew that she wasn't able to defend herself or us against whatever hate and bigotry they threw at us? So yeah, it was very prevalent. As far as education, and I know that people think the Southern drawl is an indicator of education. Just because people have a drawl doesn't mean they're stupid. there are some very stupid people down there. There's some very backwards people down there. There's some very educated people. I mean, my mother was a teacher. She went to, well, back in the day when she was young, women could either be a teacher or a housewife. There were very few things, maybe even a nurse, but there are very few things that Black women could do. And she wasn't going to be a housekeeper. Even though at some point in time she would take in washing to help earn money. And I have this stigma right now about, hiring maids and things like that because there was so much stigma related to that. But she and my father stressed education. And there are 11 of us, and almost all of us, I say 9 of us, have at least an associate's degree. And the other 2 have certifications and licenses that are well above, the normal education that people have in most communities and most families. So to say that 11 kids all received education and training says a lot about the emphasis and importance that my parents put on education. And I know there were a lot of folks like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, some months ago, I read a book about James Baldwin, and recently there was a article that was a series of articles in the New Yorker. And Baldwin, this particular biography, David Adams Leaning, I learned a great deal about reading about James Baldwin. I've seen him on YouTube and some of the speeches that he made and so on. And basically, in this autobiography or biography, David talks a great deal about the struggles Baldwin had to deal with being an African American and dealing with homosexuality, being a man who had a different sexual orientation, civil rights, and so on. Talk to me about being an African American and gay, or as we would say, LGBTQ plus.
Okay, so I am gay. That was a source of stress and loneliness for me for the longest time. Growing up, I knew that I was different, and no one ever said specifically that being gay was different, but it was a sense you got. There was a gay man who would come to my mother's house and buy Avon because she was the Avon lady. She was also like on the mother's board at the church. My dad was a deacon, and she was a PTA president. So a leader in the community. This man would come buy Avon. He would use her sample lipstick and try on lipstick and some perfume and stuff. She never once made a derogatory remark about this man, but the way people would look at him and the looks that she wouldn't necessarily give him, but there was a sense that something was wrong. Now, knowing that I may have been gay, I also knew that I wasn't like him. I didn't want to wear dresses. I didn't want to wear lipstick. I don't see anything wrong with it. That was a very strong man to live in the South, be out and gay and proud and wear lipstick and makeup and everything else. I never thought about the strength that it took for him to be himself. So understanding what James Baldwin did, and by the way, James Baldwin is my favorite author and was one of my role models and heroes. And as a writer, knowing that he was gay and out and proud was, for me, very heroic. But knowing also the struggles that he went through. He was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, but there was still so much bigotry, hatred, stigmatism, or stigma against him that he ended up leaving the United States and living in Paris because it was much easier for him to live as an out gay man, open with his sexuality, than it was for him to do so in America. Now, I think, and knowing what I went through with people who were ignorant of sexuality and issues, that it had to have been tough. And it's easier now. It was easier as I was growing up, but still tough. I couldn't imagine living back then. Although, if I had a chance to live in a time other than this, I would have gone back to the Harlem Renaissance to live with not only the likes of James Baldwin, but I mean, he was around some wonderful people, some amazing artists, African-American artists, and it's some leaders and some orators, just an amazing time in history. But it wasn't enough to protect him from the bigotry, the stigma, the racism. He was also a very skilled orator. You read some of his speeches. I mean, he was an activist. He stood up for Black rights. He fought for Black rights. Like Bayard Rustin was another one of his contemporaries who stood right along and marched right alongside Dr. King. He was gay, but because of his sexuality, he did not get the recognition for what he did for the power movement in the 60s and 70s. He was pushed aside. He was pushed into the shadows. He was one of our leaders. So was James Baldwin. Why haven't we heard this? Why are people still in the dark about this amazing man? Probably because of his sexuality. You know, and now you have kids that are coming out really early. And to me, that's different because I was afraid to talk to someone. I didn't have anyone to talk to. I thought, here's James Baldwin who's writing about his sexuality, about being out, and who was openly gay, but he couldn't even do that in the US. He had to go to France to do that. So what chance did I have being out and open in this small rural Black community that was very much so steeped in religion? Now, we're not going to get into the religion, but I will say this. Religion has caused trauma to lesbian and gay folks, LGBTQ folks all over the world. And we're trying to reconcile all of that hurt and trauma so that we can get back to our roots of spirituality and religion. I don't need a church to practice spirituality. If I want to practice religion, I could do it in my basement. But, you know, the church is a place where we've traditionally done that. And many of us want to go back to church. Some of us are too scarred and too damaged from all of the trauma.
You
I
know,
can go on and on, but I know
yeah, but you don't see the other thing is Malcolm said sometimes we have to leave our religion at the door when we're talking as African people because it gets in the way. And obviously, you know, people who enslave us, why would I accept their religion in a sense? So I'm very much reluctant to engage in deep conversation with people who don't follow their own faith. And again, as a Louis Farrakhan once said, you know, and other people said the same thing. You know, people is not what your religion you say it is what you practice. And you know, again, as James Baldwin alluded to, I see what you're doing, but it's not what I see. I hear what you're saying, but it's not what you're doing. So you know, there's these kind of euphemisms and cliches and things that we all know about people's religion. And as Malcolm and both Malcolm and Martin Luther King alluded to, Sunday is the most segregated day of the week. And again, if all these people believe in the same God, how come they worship in these different temples and places and act like they, you know, even the graveyards are segregated in America. So anyway, that's how that rolls. I was going to switch up and ask you a little bit to talk a little bit about your poem. I see you got your book in the corner, The Depth. It's called The Depth of My Soul Until the Fields. Feeds. I can't even say it today. Fields. Stephen Jackson. And I know you wrote a litany of poems and so on. Also, you've been writing poetry for a number of while. And, you know, you shared me one of the poems you wrote. And some years ago, I met an African-American scholar who worked in Lincoln. She was one of the administrators of the university system. They recruited her under false pretenses as a key administrator. When she got here, they put in broom closet and disrespected her. And, you know, she had a doctorate in education and a law degree and you name it. And, you know, Nebraska is known for doing that to African Americans from out of states when they bring them in if they got some substance. These other handkerchiefs, they don't. But she produced many poems as an outlet in her book, in her booklets that she shared with me. And she shared with me it was a way of communicating, dealing with racism and oppression. I was real impressed with the poems that she shared with me. And she was like producing like clockwork. I mean, it was like a lot of, and some very powerful poems and so on. And you describe similar concepts in some of your poems, and particularly in your book. And the particular poem that you shared with me at one point was called I'm Weary. Can you share that poem with our viewing audience and also explain the significance of that poem and why you're into poetry? So right. That's a mouthful, by the way.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
That's a sequence.
I appreciate you talking about my book, it's I Am Weary. I self-published it through Balboa Press. It is on Amazon, so if anybody's interested in it. I will start off by talking about why I write. Again, going back to James Baldwin, I understood in some of his books, the imagery that he presented took me to where he was at that point in time. If Beale Street Could Talk. It was one of those stories that it's been recently made into a movie within the last 5 years or so, but it took me to that place. I remember feeling like I was in that prison where that young man read those notes and all of those things. But there were some lines in some of his books that I copied because it was like those things were so deep, and it made me feel like he was saying what I was feeling. I started writing poetry. I think it was a class assignment or something, but I realized that it helped me express myself in a way that I wasn't able to express myself otherwise.
No, hold on. Let me just ask a quick question. When you say it helped you express yourself that you couldn't otherwise, give me some clarification. Expand that concept a little bit.
Okay. So there are many different ways, but one specific way was if I got in trouble for something with my parents, we were raised that we couldn't talk back to our parents.
Okay, gotcha.
Kids got it easy now. They can say, but mom, but dad. I couldn't say but anything, or my butt was going to get whooped. So the pain, the frustration, the anger, I would write it because I couldn't say it to my mom. I couldn't say it to my dad because that was being disrespectful and sassy. I couldn't say it to my sisters and brothers because I didn't trust that they wouldn't go back and tell mom and dad that I was upset about something. So it came out in my writing. I would talk about how I was frustrated, how I was angry and hurt, how I didn't feel loved. So that was my way of letting all of those feelings out. It was therapeutic. And anytime you talk to some writers, they will talk about how therapeutic some of the deep stuff is that they write. The poem that you asked me to read, I Am Weary, is a poem that I wrote last year. And it was after the spate of very public, very nationwide focused Black Lives Matters, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, all of those issues were coming to mind. And sometimes it takes a while for all of those feelings and all of those emotions to come out of me. So over a period of time, I was feeling these things, I was thinking about them, and then I wrote this poem. So let me read it to you. I am weary. I am weary, deep down in my soul. This pain that engulfs me is not new, it's old. From days gone by when my forefathers were stolen from their homes. To the white man's plantation, we were weary to the bone. Another day, we hear of another life lost. It hurts, but to respond, we are leery of the cost. Rights provided by the Constitution of this country don't seem to apply to me. If a police officer chooses to take my life, there's no recourse. All that's left is for my family's tears to cry. A lost life can be explained away with implied criminality or a rap sheet. Or we're lost in the darkness as we lay there getting beat. My Lord, we call you in our distress, but only you will hear. Others look on, helpless or careless, as we die filled with fear. I am Trayvon Martin, walking through a neighborhood. Just because I'm Black, I'm up to no good. I am Ahmad, out for an evening run, when up ahead, there's a white man with a gun. I am Breonna, lying in my home, 1 minute safe, the next minute gone. I am so many innocent victims, the most recent fresh in our minds, as history writes over us always just another in a long line. We're weary, we're tired, and we cannot continue the fight alone. We need to gather our people and get rid of all this wrong. Let's right the ship and stay the course. They wait for us to quit and then double down with force. They'll try to keep us down, a knee, a taser, a baton. One warrior down does not mean that they've won. Take a breath to fortify your soul. The battle will be long and it will take its toll. But we came from a mighty people whose blood fertilized America's soil. Together we can make a difference. As a unit, we will toil. It is time, my people, to take up armor, our strength as our weapon, or the day will never come where we are safe unless we make this happen. So that's the poem. And it says a lot because I am weary. I'm tired of turning on the TV and seeing that someone else has been shot and beaten or kneeled on and killed, murdered. And then hear someone say, well, but he was high. Oh, well, but he was a criminal. Oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If I'm selling a cigarette for $1 just to try to make some ends meet or to feed my family or even to buy a Burger King sandwich, what felony is that? And why does that cost me my life?
You know, Steve, as you mentioned that poem, I think one of the things that I think there's a lot of creative opportunities as you shared that, but also in other people if they get the chance to express themselves. And one of the reasons I asked the question, somewhat of, you know, when you could not speak or excuse me, talk, what was that about? And I think poetry can be a way that we can communicate. I was going to ask you a different, and we'll come back maybe to this book, but tell me a little bit more about the book and what and some other things that is inside the depth of my soul.
Well, again, I've been writing poems since I was in junior high school. At first, it just started out as kind of playful things, and every once in a while, I write something about feelings and expressing myself. But over the years, I've kind of put together a little booklet, shared it with my family, with some friends, and people have always encouraged me to write, to share, to publish a book. But I was always afraid that someone was going to read what I wrote and not think it was good enough, not think it was good at all, to laugh at it, to poke fun at it. And as an example of that, I'd shown it to some people that I knew. I won't call them friends, I'll call them acquaintances. And the one person wanted to look at it and go, well, that syntax isn't right, the grammar isn't right in the way you phrase this sentence. And those types of things really turned me off because I'm writing this from my heart and it's said the way that I mean it. And maybe it's in broken English or however you want to say it, incorrect English, whatever it is, but there's meaning in the way it's written because those words are from my heart and from my soul. And I didn't want people to judge me. So I was talking to a friend of mine in New Jersey who was a sister trying to get her life coach career off the ground. And she said, all right, Steve, I need to practice. What have you decided that you wanted to do that you haven't ever accomplished? I thought about it. And the first thing that popped into my mind was publish a book. And I said, you know, I got lots of stories that I've written. I've written a play. But I knew that I had poetry. I'm like, I can just sit down and pull poems and just publish them. Like, I'm Weary is not in my book. So in the next book that I write, I'm going to put that poem in.
Yeah, very good.
But she pushed me to do it. And she said, I'll give you 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, I want you to have contacted a publisher. I want you to have decided which poems you're going to put into the book. And I want you to be ready to go. And I said, yeah. Figured she wasn't going to follow up. But she followed up. And I give her props for that. a sister who cares and followed up with me and said, okay, I'm holding you to this. Do it. That happened in maybe July. By October, my book was published.
Good. Very good. I want to switch up if I can. I know we're chasing time a little bit, but I work and engage white people who say they're not racist and that Black lives are not important to them in contrast to Blue Lives Matter. How do we engage that school of thought as an African Americans in this society that has an inordinate level of racism? Obviously, we recently come into this critical race theory discussion, but how do you have a real discussion with folks who deny the existence of racism?
Well, everybody's got some issue with race, whether it's us with internalized racism, whether it's white people who hate Black people for whatever reason. We can say we don't see color, we can say we don't see race, but that's BS. That's nonsense. Everybody sees it. You look in the mirror, you see it. When they look at me, they see it. When they look at you, they see it. When people jump or flinch when a Black man comes around a corner and they're facing you, they're racist. There's some racist response in that reaction. Everybody has it. Another question I'd have, who's blue? Who is blue? If they say police lives matter, that's different, but don't say blue lives matter because nobody in this world is blue. But don't give me that. Police aren't dying. Police aren't the ones being murdered. Black people are the ones being murdered. I just talked about Trayvon, Ahmaud, Breonna. I mean, we can go on, the list goes on. And even after all of the stuff with George Floyd and the uproar that caused in both the Black and white communities who were allies, people are still being killed because of the color of their skin.
Wow.
Now, I joked with someone when we talk about we need to start reporting white on white crime. And it's a joke, but within that joke is some reality, because people will, this one guy would say to me all the time, hey, I just heard about another shooting in North Omaha. Everybody heard about the shooting. Why do you have to come to me and tell me that? That's very racist. I don't need you to come and report the news to me. All of the news stations in Omaha do that. The national news stations do it. If you notice something, when people do report news and it's a white person who committed a crime, very seldom do they show that picture, or very seldom do they say white male. They will say there was a suspect or a gunman killed someone. If it's a Black man, it's a Black gunman, or they show the photo. That's racism. Every time you hear something about Black on Black crime, that's racism. The United States was built on race. It was built on racism, slavery, all of the stuff, prisons, police force, community policing, all of that is about racism, about keeping people in their place or making sure that Black men, women, and children didn't gain so much. I really think that when President Obama was elected, people went out and got guns because they thought about the Nat Turner uprising. They thought that, oh my God, we got a Black man in. They're gonna hold us to account for all of the wrongs and atrocities that have happened to their Black forefathers. It was fear steeped in racism.
I'm going to ask you some other different questions. Steve, as a born-again atheist, I can't comprehend people's religion and dogmas. How do you deal with Christianity or religion and one's sexual identity? I know that we talked earlier, but sexuality in churches have been somewhat controversial, particularly in the Catholic Church and so on. But how do you deal with that today, or do you deal with that?
I am lucky that I found a church that is open and affirming in the United Church of Christ. For years.
So, in other words, there's other people with different orientations go to this church? Is it a unique church, different type of church?
The denomination itself has an open and affirming mantra. So there are some of the churches that are not open and affirming. They still believe that no matter who you are and where you are in life's journey, God's still working with you. You're welcome here. But The Bible and the church have been used as weapons to beat people, kill people, and hold people down since the beginning of time. So, having said that, when we talk about people weaponizing everything, um, finding a place that you can practice your religion and your spirituality is good, because you get to commune with other people who don't mind you as you are as a gay person, who don't mind you as you are as a Black person. But that doesn't mean that you have to stop fighting, that you have to stop educating, or that you have to stop reminding people that I can't hold hands with my spouse in a restaurant because someone might come up and say something or do something to us. I cannot
You're
kiss
talking
my
about 2021.
2021. I cannot kiss my spouse, not even on the cheek, without having someone come up and say something to me. And they use religion as their Bible. They will quote 2 or 3 Bible verses, but you ask them about another verse in that Bible, they can't tell you anything, Catholic or not. It doesn't matter whether they're Catholic, whether they're Baptist, Protestant, any type of religion. They probably couldn't tell you more. And the other thing, you know, I grew up in the church. I learned the Bible, and people will quote Bible verses to me. I can quote Bible verses right back to them. But what they don't know is that if Jesus he hung out with lepers and prostitutes and all these people. He did not hang out with the holy people, because the holy people were the most unholy of them all.
I sound like today a little bit. Let me see. We'll switch up a little bit. I consider myself somewhat of a time child. I use that metaphor, and I'm amazed at how little we leave our next and future generations about our racial struggles and oppressive conditions of this racist country. Why is it important for us to name and claim that from your perspective? And then, do you utilize, as an African American, oral tradition or written narrative in explaining your stories and so on? How do you broach how you lead that next generation of our histories and our culture? How do you approach that?
Well, it's important that we write down as much as we can of our history. I mean, in slavery days, we didn't probably have the tools and the education to write things down. We were coming from a different country as slaves, and we didn't have the tools to write those things down. We weren't allowed to write. We weren't allowed to learn to read, to write, or go to school or anything in most cases. I mean, there are exceptions to that rule, but oral tradition was important, and it's important to us now because even as I'm in middle age, I guess you could say, I'm learning things about my family that I didn't know, but it's oral tradition. It's things that are passed from one member of the family to another member of the family. We really don't have a way to verify or justify that. There weren't birth certificates, there weren't death certificates. So we rely on people to tell us who we're related to. And our social networks were really pretty close relatives. And back in that day, then sometimes we ended up marrying relatives. They weren't necessarily close relatives, but they were with our social network. We were segregated. We had the same community. Now we have a worldwide network. We can go anywhere and do anything. And if we don't know our history, which I think is a reason that critical race theory is important, because these young kids don't know what our forefathers went through. They don't know that in the 13th Amendment, there was this sly little thing that says, unless someone has committed a crime, you cannot enslave them, but by punishment if they committed a crime. And that was a way that they started community policing, because if they accused someone and convicted them of a crime, then they could send them out and make them enslaved again. Peonage. No, there's so many things.
So Steve, here's a point. If they don't know, then how do they learn? I mean, is that part of that on us as a group or as a species?
That is absolutely on us. Each one of us should teach at least one of us. If we teach someone and have them pass that information forward, we learn. We will continue to learn. We need to have education in the schools. Critical race theory is important. And the people who don't want it there are the people who want to keep us down. And without us knowing this, knowing our history and the history of the United States, even more than just slavery and Black history, what about Native history? What about Latino history?
Well, it's obviously not teaching it in the public schools on the level as a result of what's coming out. In other words, garbage in, garbage out. And again, I'm not trying to be funny, but as someone said, use reverse engineering. If you see people who growing up hating themselves, shooting each other, doing all the craziness, they don't have appreciation of their great culture. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to get to a last couple of questions before we close out. Oftentimes, we've talked about, intersectionality. I've heard that used many times and so on. And I hear white women and white folks talk about it differently. I hear African Americans talk about it different, and so on. What does that mean, and how do you wrestle with that concept if you're going to deconstruct it, as Malcolm says, make it plain for our people? What does intersectionality mean? And again, it's convoluted or convoluted in a sense. That's the word I want. But how do you explain that to people who don't know what that means?
First time I heard it, I said the same thing. What is this? What is this new term? There's always something that comes up. Intersectionality just means where things connect, where they cross over. So how are things related to each other? Is racism related to bigotry? The intersectionality of the two. So bigotry could include homophobia. It could include gender. Yeah. What is it? Where does that? If you think about it from a road perspective, if you're driving and you come to a crossroads, you call that an intersection, right? So where do these two things cross? The intersection of two different ideas, two different thoughts, two different concepts.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Now we got about a couple of minutes left, and just wanted to throw back out to this book. Where can people get copies of this book of yours? You mentioned Amazon. Is that the only place you can get it from?
I have a website. It's stevegjackson.com. It's a capital S. And don't put Stephen in there, because there is an author out there named Stephen Jackson, and he writes occult stuff.
That's not a cult. I don't think this is.
I'm not a cult, no. But Amazon.com or stevegjackson.com. Good. So if you don't mind, I want to read at least one quick poem.
Okay. Before we close out.
So I'll leave you with this one. This is Genesis 1. In the beginning, we created our passion, and there was ecstasy. And on the second day, we discovered laughter and companionship. And it all seemed perfect. Not so. We've discovered our own version of the garden. But which is the serpent? Selfishness, expectation, or reluctance? If the words were "let there be love," would we hear and take heed? Or will we continue to struggle with what we have going? In the beginning, we seem to share the same breath, survive on the same heartbeat. Now there is silence and dislike. In the beginning, it all seemed right. Now there's reality. A lot of the poems that I write are about love and loss. So again, it's therapeutic, it's cathartic. It got some of that stuff out when I couldn't express myself. I didn't feel that I had someone to talk to. And for the people who don't have someone to talk to about their frustrations, their anger, their hurt, their trauma, their anxiety, writing could be a way to help somebody, instead of going and grabbing a gun and shooting somebody.
Good. We're down to the last question. I always like to give the guests an opportunity. Do you have any closing comments for our listening or viewing audience?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my voice and to push my book and talk about that. I think one of the things that I've learned in my life is that Black men don't love each other enough. Black women don't love each other enough. Black women love each other more than Black men love Black men. But even in the gay community, we have so much internalized hatred or fear or something for each other that we can be walking across from each other on the sidewalk. We will look everywhere but at each other. We will not speak. You and I have had this conversation. There is a book by Marlon Riggs. I can't think of it, but it talks about Black men loving Black men is a very strong revolution. When we learn to love each other, we can stand together and we can face any army, and we can defeat racism, we can defeat bigotry, but we've got to learn to love ourselves first before we can love each other.
Good. Well, Stephen G. Jackson, I appreciate you being on this edition of Moore's Throwing Down Heavy Light. As you know, we constantly try to bring people to the table to talk about various issues in our community because our local media doesn't do a good job in raising the issue of race and ethnicity and some of the issues from some of the grass tops and grassroots. So it's always a pleasure to bring somebody on, to pick someone who's written a series of litany of poems and things that express some meaningful situations that impact all of us. So we hope to maybe have you come back again and talk about some other things that you're working on to help our community lift itself up in terms of some of these trying times. So really appreciate you being here.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. We've hoped you've enjoyed this edition of More Throwing Down Heavy Light. Check our website out, more.org, where we will continue to bring in unusual voices and people who can share information that can help us grow as a community. Again, one of the things that's so important for us as a species or as a human being is to leave breadcrumbs and legacies for the next generation. So we hope that this will be one of those chapters or leaves in the books that can help educate our community. Join us again next time. Barocco.